Despair welded into metal. Picture this. The year is 1944. Germany. The air is thick with the smell of soot and fear. The sky, which was once the imperial domain of the Luftwaffe, is now tightly stitched with the contrails of British and American bombers. They come every day and every night, like mechanical demons of retribution. The factories that are supposed to churn out wonder weapons lie in ruins. There's a drop of gasoline left in the engines. There are only a handful of experienced pilots. Time is running out. And at this very moment, when logic and strategy scream for surrender, German engineering thought, driven to despair, gives birth to something on the brink of insanity. Something monstrous, beautiful in its technogenic ugliness, desperate and genius all at once. This is not just an airplane. This is Siamese twins, fused together by steel, copper, and the last hope of a dying empire. This is the Mistel, German for mistletoe, a parasitic plant. The name itself is a verdict. This is not a story about a weapon of victory. This is a story about a weapon of despair. About how the agony of an entire state forces it to spend its last strength on projects doomed from the very start. And you know what? Looking at it today, I catch myself thinking, aren't we modern people in our lives and businesses sometimes creating the exact same mistels, expensive, complex, but useless solutions for problems that no longer exist or were lost long ago? The origins of madness, from mother and child to father and death. The idea of combining two aircraft into one flying unit wasn't new. It was in the air, like a premonition. Back in the late 30s, the British, those pragmatic islanders, came up with the Short Mayo project. Imagine a huge flying boat mothership. The Mayo carried a small male seaplane, the Mercury, the child on its back. Together, they would take off, gain altitude and range. The child would separate and fly across the Atlantic with mail, saving fuel. Elegant? Elegant. Peaceful? Absolutely. The Germans, with their famous ability to take someone else's idea and turn it inside out for military purposes, looked at this idol and saw something else. They saw not a mother and child, but a rider and his lethal steed. Their gaze fell upon the old, worn-out, but still sturdy fuselages of the Ju-88 bombers. These machines had already served their time, their resources were depleted, and training new pilots on them was long and expensive. And then a thought was born in the engineers' heads, worthy of both admiration and a psychiatric evaluation. What if we remove from the Ju-88 the entire crew, all navigation instruments, all defensive armament? Leave only the fuselage, wings, engines, and a giant warhead? And control this steel ghost, this flying zombie bomb, will be a pilot in a small, agile fighter sitting atop this monster? Imagine the scale of this idea. It's pure cinema. You're not just piloting a plane, you're leading an entire bomber, packed with 3,800 kilograms of explosives on a leash. You are a kamikaze who doesn't need to die. You are the brain attached to the body of a killer. You are the last argument of despair. And the most astonishing thing is that it was relatively cheap. Old Ju-88's practically free. The FW-190 or BF-109 fighters mass-produced machines. Conversion minimal compared to creating a new type of aircraft. It was a typically German, pedantic, and yet insane answer to the crisis. Technically intricate, incredibly risky, but budget-friendly and theoretically incredibly effective. Guys, have you encountered this in your own lives? When instead of admitting the failure of an old project, we start bolting a bunch of new solutions onto it, spending our last strength. Write in the comments examples of your life mistels. It will be interesting to read. The technical masterpiece of agony. How did it work? Let's try to figure out how this hellish machine functioned. It's not just two planes glued together with tape. It's a most complex symbiosis. The monster's nervous system in the cramped, stuffy cockpit of the fighter-rider. The pilot was not just a pilot. He was the god of this two-headed dragon. In front of him, not only his own instruments, but also duplicate controls for the bomber. With the help of special electromechanical actuators and a whole web of cables, he could remotely control the control column, throttle levers, and even the landing gear of the Ju-88. He was leading into battle not just a combination, but a single organism, until the very last moment, until that fateful separation. The moment of truth separation. But how does the pilot save himself? After all, he's sitting on a bomb. Here, German engineers showed their famous ingenuity. For separation, cunning pyrotechnic bolts were used, small explosive charges that, on command, would sever the massive steel coupling nodes. It worked, bang, and the connection is gone. But that's not all. To prevent the heavy fighter from catching the back of its former carrier during the breakaway, the rear mounting strut was made folding. It would literally buckle, pulling the fighter's tail upward. A safe breakaway was guaranteed. Genius and terrifying. The beast's heart, the warhead. And now for the main part. What did this flying suicide bomber carry? This was not an ordinary high-explosive bomb. This was something else. A gigantic-shaped charge warhead weighing those same 3,800 kilograms. During tests, this thing could penetrate up to 8 meters of steel, or up to 20 meters of reinforced concrete. Can you imagine? This is not just an explosion. This is a kinetic dagger. A beam of energy designed to destroy targets that ordinary bombs couldn't handle. British battleships in fortified harbors. Underground command centers like the one where Churchill himself met. Bridges, dams, giant factories. The Mistel was not a weapon of terror like the V1 or V2. It was a killer surgeon, created for one precise but crushing blow. It was a masterpiece of improvisation, born in the hell of total war. But, as is often the case with brilliant improvisations, in practice, everything went wrong. The economy of madness. What did this wonder weapon cost? Now let's turn on our cold minds and look at the Mistel from the point of view of economics and resources. This is perhaps the most instructive part of our story. The context of 1944. By this time, the economy of the Third Reich was an agonizing organism. Systematic Allied bombing had destroyed oil refineries. For example, the famous Operation Ball against synthetic fuel plants. Aviation gasoline production had fallen dramatically. There was a shortage of non-ferrous metals, steel, and rubber. But most importantly, there was a catastrophic shortage of qualified pilots. Those who had gone through the school of the Battle of Britain were almost all gone. Young recruits were thrown into battle after just a few dozen hours of flight time. The cost of a Mistel. Ju-88, an old but still complex to produce bomber. It could have been dismantled for parts or used for training. FW-190, one of the best fighters of the war. An acutely scarce, most valuable machine. Every such fighter given to the Mistel was not flying in the air defense system, not protecting Germany's skies from bombers. The pilot, the most non-renewable resource. Training a pilot for such a complex operation required time and fuel, which were not available. Fuel. One sortie of a Mistel combination consumed as much fuel as several regular combat sorties. These were liters scooped from the last reserves. Analysis from an ROI, return on investment perspective. What do we get as a result? One Mistel is one target. One attack. The risk of being shot down on approach colossal. Accuracy extremely low. The pilot and the fighter had to not just bring the combination to the target. He had to aim, using a complex method, and at the last moment separate. In practice, this was incredibly difficult. Compare this to the same guided bombs, HS-293. They were simpler, cheaper. They could be hung under a regular bomber, which could make several sorties, or with the massive raids of thousands of Allied bombers, which, despite losses, methodically erased German industry from the face of the earth. The Mistel was a weapon with negligible return. It consumed disproportionately huge resources that could have been directed to something simpler and more effective. This is a classic mistake of a dying system. Instead of optimizing what it has, it throws its last strength into an expensive, ambitious, but hopeless high-level project. Friends, doesn't this remind you of anything? Maybe your boss is investing the company's last money into some super new CRM system instead of paying salaries? Or the government is building a giant stadium while the city's roads are broken. Right examples of such a Mistel economy in the modern world. I'm waiting for your comments. Combat use, heroism, blood spilled in vain, and the harsh truth. And so our wonder monster goes to the front. Its baptism of fire took place in Normandy in the summer of 1944. The Allies had just gained a foothold on the coast, and the Germans threw their secret weapon into battle. A bad start. Already on June 14, 1944, the very first Mistel combination was shot down. By whom? A fast and agile Canadian night fighter, the Mosquito. It mistook the cumbersome, clumsy pair for a carrier of a glide bomb, and without much trouble sent it into the English Channel. This was a sign that the Mistel's vulnerability to enemy fighters was its Achilles heel. The only success? On June 24th and 25th, another combination attacked the British frigate Nith. The ship received heavy damage, but it did not sink. Yes, it was disabled, but it remained afloat and was towed away for repairs. And this episode, which is sometimes recorded in reports as a success, actually emphasizes the tragicomedy of the whole undertaking. To destroy one frigate, titanic efforts were required, 2 aircraft, unique technology, the risk to the pilot, and the ship survived. The plans for using the Mistels were truly Napoleonic. Operation Iron Hammer, a strike by Mistels on power plants near Moscow. Just imagine, these hybrids were supposed to fly halfway across Europe, over territory swarming with Soviet air defenses and fighters. It would have been pure suicide. Another plan, an attack on the British naval base at Scapa Flow. A top-secret, well-protected target. But reality, as always, made its own adjustments. On April 10, 1945, American bombers discovered at an airfield in Rechlin a whole 18 ready Mistels. One massive raid, and all that remained of the Reich's last hope for a strategic turnaround was a pile of charred metal. War is not only about what you can create, but also about what you can protect. In the spring of 45, when Soviet tanks were already rushing towards Berlin, the surviving Mistels were thrown onto the Eastern Front with one primitive task: to destroy the bridges across the Oder and Neisse rivers to delay the advance. Several bridges were indeed damaged. But what does a damaged bridge mean for the engineering troops of the Red Army, which had gone through the entire war? The crossings were restored in a matter of hours, at most days. German losses, however, were monstrous. 6 Ju-88s, 2 Bf-109s were lost, and most importantly, pilots and fuel. The last drops of blood and gasoline were spilled into the sand. The lessons of the Mistel. Why do we still remember this failure? Why does the story of the Mistel still grip us today, almost 80 years later? Because it is an eternal plot, an archetype. Mistel versus Aphrodite. The Americans, by the way, also experimented with a similar idea, Project Aphrodite. They took old, worn-out B-17 flying fortresses, stuffed them with 20 tons of explosives, and tried to control them remotely, directing them at super-protected targets like submarine bases. The pilots would take off, set the plane on course, activate the explosives, and eject. The result? The same story. Complex, expensive, unreliable, and almost fruitless. Despair, like a virus, affects all warring parties and gives birth to equally ugly projects. The paradox of simplicity. And you know what was truly effective? Simple solutions. The same German guided bombs HS-293 or Fritz X. Yes, they were also not perfect, but they combined relative cheapness, the possibility of use from different carriers, and sufficiently high accuracy. It was with these that the Italian battleship Roma was heavily damaged. Simplicity is the key to reliability. Complexity is the key to failure. The lesson of the Mistel is that you cannot win by betting on one move. War, like life, is won not by one superweapon, but by a system, the economy, logistics, personnel training, a mass of simple and reliable solutions. The Mistel is a symbol of agony, an attempt to replace an entire collapsing system. And it failed miserably, as it was destined to fail. Friends, our story has come to an end. This was a story not about a weapon, but about human genius, which ran into a dead end of its own madness. Please write in the comments what you took away from this story for yourself. Where in the modern world do you see such mistels? And most importantly, subscribe to the channel, like, share this video with your friends. Your activity is a signal to YouTube that such deep and long-form content is needed by people. Let's prove together that real, thoughtful content is always valuable. This was your host. See you next time in new investigations.